Hi all. This is Sherry George from the League of Women Voters in Alaska. And while we are waiting for a few more people to come and join us in our conversation with Kat Duffy, we're really interested if you could open up your chat, because that's where you'll be able to pose questions. But also just type in now why you came to this particular meeting and what you might be interested in hearing, at least based on the description we had to the invitation and Kat's bio. So if you could work on that for a couple of minutes while we let a few more people show up, that would be great. And then we'll get started with our intro and a bit on Kat's background, and then she will take it over. And we'll have questions at the end, so please type your questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to sort of group them up or get to as many of them as we can before the end of the session. As I can see, some people are already busy typing in, so that's great. It also helps us tailor this, or helps Kat tailor this presentation to what you're really interested in. It's different people come for different reasons, so it's nice to be able to look at those comments and say, okay, folks are really interested in this, and so maybe I'll spend a little more time on that than I might otherwise. So we really appreciate you doing this. Folks, I know more of you have ideas out there. It would be great if we saw some more in the chat. So we'll start officially here in like another minute.
All right, is your text slave coming on? Sorry, is your text slave coming on, Sherry, to say, I think I forgot to admit people to the waiting room, so nobody heard what you said at the start. So you might want to say that again. Sorry.
Right. Hey, folks, this is Sherry George with the League of Women Voters of Alaska, calling from the far north and with our partners in Maine. And what we'd like you to do while we're waiting for a few more people to come to the meeting is enter in the chat why you decided to join this particular meeting and what you might be interested in, at least based on what you know about the topic we're going to have. We'll also be using the chat for questions. So if you have questions throughout Kat's presentation, please type those questions in and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So thanks. Type away. I see at least some folks I know on here from the Alaska contingency, so I might start calling out names if I don't see some people typing in here. Pointing fingers.
I'm excited to see someone coming in from Spokane. We have a cabin outside of Springdale.
Yes, where you're from, that's a really good info, and just having what people are interested in will help Kat tailor her presentation. She's nimble, she's young, she's nimble, she can switch on the fly, unlike some of us who have to have the type script,
I am at that age where I'm, God bless anyone who tells me that I'm young.
You are young.
It's, I now feel my knees and it's just annoying. It's really, I really resent being so consistently reminded of my joints. There's so many things I love about my 40s, but that's not one of them.
It's a good time.
Life was so much easier when I was just bouncy.
Yeah. Well, we've got a pretty good crowd here, so maybe we should get started. So again, you all, thank you for coming. Welcome to our conversation on defending democracy in the digital world. And we're pleased to have Kat Duffy with us, and I'll give a brief bio in just a second. Again, I'm Sherry Jor with the League of Women Voters of Alaska. And our league in Alaska is partnering with the League of Women Voters of Maine to offer this monthly series. So we're here tonight to understand the potential threats to elections and ways in which we can take an active part in defending our democracy. You know, as Black History Month comes to a close, we're reminded that protecting voting rights and faith in elections requires continuing vigilance and our defense. In Alaska, we just celebrated Elizabeth Peratrovich Day, and a name may not be familiar to you all, for her landmark work for civil rights that was instrumental in the passage of Alaska's Anti-Discrimination Act of, guess what, 1945. The first Anti-Discrimination Act passed by a territory or state in the United States. So voting rights, secure elections, anti-discrimination are long ongoing issues, but now we're into an era of potential threats from a daunting array of commercial decisions by companies, generative AI tools, and foreign and domestic influence operations. So our speaker, Kat Duffy, is here to help us understand and offer insights on what is happening and thoughts on what we can do. Kat is a senior fellow for digital and cyberspace policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is an independent, nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to being a resource to help understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. She has more than 2 decades of experience operating at the nexus of emerging technology, democratic principles, corporate responsibility, and human rights. All things that League is interested in, of course. Most recently, she directed the Task Force for a Trustworthy Future Web at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, where she served as a resident senior fellow and published the Task Force Comprehensive Report, Scaling Trust on the Web, which you can read online. It's a wonderful resource, but be prepared. So Kat, please take it away.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sherry. And thank you to all of you for joining. What an amazing crowd and what a privilege to be able to speak with all of you. I'm somewhat randomly joining you today from the canteen of the British Embassy here in Washington, D.C. It's if anybody would like to see what the cafeteria looks like at the British Embassy, here it is. And my laptop is sitting on a pillow. So I believe in exceedingly high-tech solutions to challenges. I thought maybe I'd give you just a little background or context into how I came into these issues and this question, so you know me a little bit better. And then I thought from there, I might briefly review what we're seeing at the global level this year, and then talk a little bit about how that might, how we can think about that in terms of our own domestic elections, and then turn it over into a Q&A. Does that sound good for everyone, more or less, as a structure? We're thumbs upping? We're good. Ooh, oh yeah. You guys, AI, uninformed consent. If you do 2 thumbs up in Zoom, it's going to do fireworks. And if you do 1 thumbs up, sometimes you're going to get a thumbs up bubble. So just heads up. I already had a very awkward virtual roundtable for the Council on Foreign Relations with a human rights expert from Pakistan who was talking about the difficulties of the Pakistan election and did a thumbs up. And suddenly I had fireworks in this very serious Zoom. And it was a little mortifying. So apologies if I fireworks and thumbs up you inadvertently this whole session. So I started volunteering for my first political campaign when I was 8 years old. I would go to Ron Mazzoli's campaign election office and I would stuff envelopes, and I had a strawberry shortcake Schwinn with a basket on it. And I would fill my basket with Mazzoli for Congress buttons. And then I would bike around my neighborhood and I would hand out Mazzoli for Congress buttons. And When I was 16, I was a congressional page in the House of Representatives. My grandfather was a state senator in Kentucky. And so I come from a long love of local and state politics and a deep commitment to the importance of local and state politics. And so I'm really grateful to see so many interested folks here today. I am also a trailing spouse in the Foreign Service. So I have myself worked for the United Nations and the State Department, but my husband is also a career State Department employee. And so we've lived all over the world. So I've spent about half of my adult life inside the United States and then about half of my adult life outside of the United States. So I've lived in Colombia, in Cuba, in Tunisia, in South Africa, in the UK, a little bit in Spain. My husband was in Kenya. So I view the world as a sort of, as the world. I view my world as the world, as opposed to Washington, D.C. or the United States or Kentucky. And I think that informs a lot of the way that I think about these issues. I started working on questions around tech and policy in college. So I got my first paid gig in this space when I helped Goldman Sachs draft their Y2K due diligence record. And so when people talk to me about generative AI, I tell them there is no hype cycle you can come up with that I have not already lived through. So I have a healthy skepticism of techno-solutionism. I have a healthy skepticism of hype cycles. And I also have a healthy, I would say, a healthy respect for when we're dealing with something that is truly transformative and real. So I've navigated all of these, and I'm happy to talk to folks about where I think the real issues are. In terms of 2024, one of the things that makes this year really interesting is the sheer number of elections. This is the largest number of elections that we have seen at a national level globally in a generation. And we won't see a field like this again likely until 2048. So at the moment, we're looking at around 80 national elections happening this year, affecting about 4.2 billion people, which is about 49% of the world's population. So you're talking about an absolutely massive spread, right, of elections going on. If you are reading about the global elections, you may see some wildly divergent numbers. And that is because there are different ways to think about this and different ways to calculate elections. So if you see the number 2 billion, that tends to be a reference to the number of people who are voting. I use 4.2 billion because it's the population number of the countries. And I think that there are a lot of people impacted by elections beyond just voters. So I tend to focus on the number of people who are impacted as opposed to just the people casting a ballot. The Economist is a really good source for this. They have a very good methodology for how they've determined that number. And that's the number that I now rely on. So that's where my number is coming from, because at some point I had to land on one. One of the things that I also think is very interesting about this particular election is, or this particular electoral cycle, is that more and more we have elections that are running across social media platforms, but also broader digital platforms. Think of Google search, think of WhatsApp chats, right? So not just Facebook, right? But a broader array of platforms. Wikipedia is another good example that voters in different countries are using to access electoral information. We tend to think about elections in the foreign affairs space as being domestic in nature. They're boundaried. We tend to think about them within their geographic boundary in terms of how they operate and how they are sort of under threat or impacted. So election observation, for example, is generally people fly in right before an election and they watch, and did people cast votes, and how did that look, and was there violence, and they write a report and they leave, right? In an internet connected world where we have 70% of the world more or less now is online, in an internet connected world, the attack surface for elections and for threats suddenly shifts from being one that is about a purely local geographic environment to one that is a digital broad surface. You have a much broader surface area. for an attack or just for influence. It doesn't have to be malevolent, just influence. What we don't have are, I would say, global systems that are designed to actually address that, right? So when our electoral systems, observations, research, analysis tends to be what I think of as analog, tends to be pretty old school in the way that we think about elections. And the largest companies that have platforms that are operating in these countries have significantly cut trust and safety resources over the past 2 years. So they have significantly cut investments in their internal teams that are designed to help keep a platform safe for users. That's due to a couple of reasons. One is that the tech economy contracted generally. So tech companies simply made lots of cuts, and trust and safety teams were among those. The second reason is that there has been a lot more regulation now globally, especially in Europe with the Digital Services Act, which means that companies are having to invest a lot more money in compliance and building compliance systems that will align with regulatory measures rather than investing in like an innovative new approach to, for example, challenging disinformation. Instead, they're investing in transparency reporting and due diligence reporting and the things that will get them fined if they don't do it well. So resources have shifted to a compliance mode as opposed to an innovation mode in some spaces. We've also seen an increase in the use of generative AI to do a lot of what we call content moderation functions. So to do a lot of the scanning of content that is going on a platform and do it more quickly. That means less humans are in the mix. It's still up in the air how effective that is. Finally, we have seen, especially in the United States for the US headquartered companies, a very, very deep politicization of the work of companies to moderate content, to try to counteract disinformation, to deal with misinformation. And there have been so many lawsuits, so many subpoenas, so many threats, so many congressional hearings, so many state laws passed that the companies very frankly are pulling back. So have companies like Meta, for example, saying, we're just not going to do news and politics, right? We have a new platform, it's Threads, and it's not going to be about news and politics. We're not going to have it there. So you're also seeing the companies pull back from their own political will to engage, I would say. That's going to be somewhat of an issue in the United States, but abroad in countries that aren't producing a lot of revenue for the companies, where they have digital reach, but they don't actually care very much how the company is being used. There's often sort of not the type of monitoring and not the type of analysis that you would ideally want. And so things are flying in other countries that would never fly, domestically or possibly in, Canada or Western Europe, if it were happening in those countries. So that's the sort of explanation of kind of the digital surface and then the tools that we have to manage the digital surface. And I should add, I'm focusing very specifically on information platforms right now. I'm not focusing on cybersecurity and cybersecurity threats, which are a whole other ball of wax. So we can talk about that if you all want to. But I'm talking right now more about the information questions because those tend to be what people are more interested in. And then finally, now we have the rise of these generative AI tools, right? So raise your hand if you keep hearing about AI or generative AI? Like how many of us are navigating this? Raise 2 hands if you really feel strongly that you know what people are talking about. Raise 1 hand if you kind of think you know what people are talking about. Raise no hands if you have no idea what people are talking about. Yeah, that's a healthy mix. And I congratulate all of you who said no hands on your honesty. So we have the rise of these generative AI tools. So I thought it might be useful to talk for a minute about what generative AI potentially changes and what it doesn't, right? Generative AI basically makes it faster, cheaper, and easier to produce video, audio, and text. and photos as well. So images, text, audio, and video. You can do it faster, you can do it easier, you can do it across more languages, and it becomes much cheaper. That's a lot of what generative AI actually allows. It doesn't fundamentally change what you can do. It changes how easy it is to do it and the speed and the scale with which you can then disseminate that. Okay. In particular, with the creation of, I'm sure what you've heard about deep fakes, right? So fake videos of folks, right? With what we call synthetic media, so AI generated video, audio, with synthetic media, the types of capabilities, the type of technical expertise you used to have to be able to have to truly create a realistic seeming fake video or a realistic sounding fake audio was pretty advanced. It was more sort of nation state, right? Intelligence community, digital mercenary type level of expertise. Now, we had convincing deepfake videos in Bangladesh that were produced through an LA startup and a $24 a month app subscription. We had a very charming, sort of avuncular dancing AI avatar of the lead presidential candidate in Indonesia. And that was produced with Midjourney, which is a free online source. So I call this because I'm at CFR and I have to be fancy, I call this a post-market pre-norms world, which is to say that we have this entire market of tools that are basically publicly available, right? That are cheap, that are accessible, that operate in many, many languages. And we have basically no societal norms around how it's appropriate to use them. We don't have laws about how to use them, but we also just don't have a baseline agreement about how to use them. And let's be clear, we haven't even agreed on when it's okay to have the speaker on your cell phone, right? We're still annoyed at people in grocery stores because they've turned the speaker on their cell phone and you're like, what are you doing? What are you doing? This is not a speaker moment, right? I don't need to hear your conversation. And that's been 15, 20 years. So the idea of when we're going to come to agreement societally on when and how it's okay to use information that is AI generated, we have a long road ahead of us, because the exact same technology that you can use to create, for example, what we recently saw, AI generated images of Taylor Swift in pornographic images that were flying all over social media. That exact same technology is going to be used for parody. It's going to be used for satire. It's going to be used for any number of types of expression that we want to protect and that we value societally, because any society that can't mock its government is probably not a free society. So this is the real challenge in terms of this year. We don't know how all these tools are going to be used. They're going to be used in very different, very new, very funny, creative ways, and probably also in some very nefarious ways. But we don't really know what we're wandering into. And so globally, when you also have diminished rule of law, right, in a lot of countries, it's a moment where we're seeing decreasing democracy globally, increasing authoritarianism, which makes these global elections very high stakes in terms of who stays in power or who can come to power. And we're seeing the way that these tools are being used, in some cases, upend that in really interesting ways that might be good for democracy. And in other instances, really help to install authoritarians who might not otherwise have had the same chance. So that's what we've seen sort of so far in Bangladesh, in Taiwan, in Pakistan, and in Indonesia. just in 2024. I will say, for the most, it's not clear yet what the persuasive capability of the AI generated text, for example, or arguments is. Historically, we've said in this space that disinformation campaigns don't tend to influence voters on issues or candidates. They have historically tended to influence voters on the credibility of process. So they've been better at sowing distrust in process and distrust in institutions than they have been at changing people's minds on an individual issue where they already hold an opinion or an individual candidate, historically. There's some new research coming out that's showing that arguments, different marketing mechanisms that are being produced by generative AI-based tools are more persuasive than we would have expected. And so we don't know, honestly. It's not terribly clear. That doesn't mean it's a disinformation campaign. It may just be micro-targeted advertising to you based on a lot of data harvesting around like where you live, right? What you buy on Amazon, like what your interests are, right? What type of car you own, all of that data is out there in the world, what your age is, what your race is, where you might have voted before. And you may end up getting very, very micro-targeted emails, right? Or social media posts, or text messages, or mailers. And that might be more persuasive to you than something would have been in the past. But we don't know. We don't know yet from looking at any of the elections globally how that's actually playing out. So that is kind of the world. And I'm going to close with this one other last part, which is foreign influence, which I think a lot of folks in the United States have been hearing about as well. We have seen concerted influence campaigns, especially from China, a little bit Iran, and certainly Russia. We saw the Russian attempts in the 2016 election, the 2020 election, the 2022 election, and fully expect to see the most aggressive push yet from Russia in 2024. And that's because the technical capabilities are stronger. America is arguably a little more fragile than it was, a little weaker in terms of trust. So it's a little easier to break. And also in 2022, Russia was trying, but was so focused on Ukraine that it couldn't pull it together as much. In 2024, Russia has a little more space to think about this, and the stakes are very high because I fully expect to see Russian influence campaigns aimed at both increasing divisiveness, which is their standard approach, but also very much amplifying domestic narratives that are anti-Ukraine. So the way that Russian influence has tended to work is not some of the traditional modes they've used haven't been very effective, where they've like tried to put in bots, created fake accounts, and tried to generate their own sort of very janky Russian sounding, like, guy on Twitter says this, and everyone is like, you are not, like, your name is not whatever, Mary Ann Smith. Like, come on, right? But where we have seen them have a fair degree of success is finding domestic narratives that are already extremist or fringe, and then really amplifying that particular narrative. And I know, for example, in Maine, everyone has just seen some terrible violence in the past few months as a result of extremism. And I would fully expect that the increase that we have in domestic extremism in the United States, as well as tensions around immigration and funding of Ukraine, will be three things that the Russians just hammer in on and try to promote more and more and more. And they are able to promote that over something like 50 different digital platforms. So there are some companies that do have very strong controls and programs in place. Meta, which has Microsoft, or which has WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, and Nextdoor, which people don't realize that Meta owns Nextdoor. they have different types of controls across those different properties, but Meta is very sophisticated and very focused, especially on the domestic elections. It's Meta, Microsoft, and Google have unbelievably sophisticated operations. But in the United States, you have people using TikTok, Discord, Reddit, Wikipedia, Google search. Now you have chatbots as well from the AI systems. You have Snap for, kids are using things like Snap. You have alt-right social media platforms. So Truth Social, Parler, Gab. And then you have WhatsApp groups, and you have text message groups, and you have Nextdoor. And so there's this whole range. And what we've seen is that these influence operations don't only exist on one platform. They are cross-populated across all of these platforms. And so many of these platforms don't have a strong trust and safety mechanism or team. And so even if it gets smacked down sort of on Facebook, it tends to propagate in other places, and then it will boomerang back, if that makes sense. And we've seen that dynamic play out a lot. So when we think about the digital threats, that's sort of what we're looking at globally and then in the United States. So I want to take a look at this chat quickly and ask if there's folks who want to raise their hand. I want to stop talking. And if folks want to raise their hands as well with questions or to ask me to dig deep into something, I'm happy to do it. So I'm seeing regulation of generative AI ads, deepfake ads, 100%. Code of ethics in generative AI, absolutely. This is an easy one. The big tech companies, a lot of them have announced 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, sorry, 4 weeks ago. They announced what was called the Tech Accord. It came out of the Munich Security Conference, and they are commitments that the companies have made around generative AI and elections in particular. And so I'm happy to forward a link to Sherry if she wants to disseminate it after this to some news articles or the language of those accords. The challenge here is that with these types of commitments, I wrote an article recently about the Indonesian elections where I dig into this if anyone's interested. But Midjourney has a policy that's very clear that says it can't be used for political elections. Well, the AI avatar for the Indonesian presidential election was created using Midjourney. OpenAI has a policy that says it can't be used to support elections. Well, a consultant in Indonesia sold services to 700 legislators in Indonesia to do micro-targeting and speech writing, and he built the entire application off of ChatGPT, which is OpenAI's generative AI text tool, right? And he used that to create images as well, and he's treated that as a beta test for the Indian elections, which are coming up and which are some of the most consequential elections globally this year. So they have a policy, they have an agreement, they have a commitment, that's great. They don't have a strong history of actually being able to enforce those in a meaningful way. And so that's why voluntary principles are important, and they are helpful, and they are a great first step. You also have to take them, I would say, with a grain of salt, especially when you start talking about smaller communities, people who are operating in marginalized languages, people who are operating in poorer countries or poorer communities. That's where those policies tend to fall apart. Sherry, do you want to moderate questions, or should I just call in folks? How would you like to?
Well, let's kind of go back and forth. I see Becky G from Oregon has her hand up. So why don't we take some hands up and then go to back to some questions on the text, on the chat. And then we also had written up a few questions that I'd forwarded you that I think we would like to get to. So why don't we start with Becky and then kind of rotate around.
Hey, thanks. Thanks so much for talking to us. And oh my God, fireworks? I don't know about that. So we're working on legislation in Oregon. Frankly, it's a copy of stuff that's going on elsewhere. I saw Linnell on here somewhere. It's straight from Washington, some of it. So they're saying, oh, if we see deepfakes or manipulation used nefariously in campaign ads, we're going to nail you. I'm sorry, the ship is sailing. If you see the deep fake, you can't unsee it. So what I'm concerned about, although we are participating because, hello, we have to do something, how can we help to pre-inoculate people so that voters don't lose faith in our elections? They can still trust what's going on. How can you trust what you see when you really can't? You can't tell anymore what's fake.
So I'm typing into the chat. Pre-bunking, for those who don't know,
Pre-bunking, right.
pre-bunking is a term that we use in the information space. It comes from inoculation theory, which ironically is one of the biggest challenges in the information space. And pre-bunking basically means that if you tell somebody how somebody's going to make a sucker of them, they're less likely to be a sucker. That's kind of the easiest way to describe it. So you can feed somebody a little bit of information around like, hey, this is what you're likely to see. Or if somebody were trying to fool you, this is what that might look like. And you create a general sense of skepticism, and then someone is less likely to believe that. Jigsaw is a research arm of Google. Their head of research is a wonderful woman named Beth Goldberg. And she has been working on and researching pre-bunking now for 6 years, I think, at least. So I highly recommend going to Jigsaw to check out their work on pre-bunking. Some of the things that we've seen, pre-bunking can be effective. It has a relatively short lifespan, so you have to renew it. It also has to be highly contextualized. So in comparative studies in Poland and Slovenia or Slovakia, I'm mixing up my slows, in one of those two countries, the pre-bunking was effective when it was in Poland and it was done in Polish, when they used the same ads and everything else, but they dubbed it into Slovakian or Slovenian, it was significantly less effective. So even though many of the issues were the same, the people were going to be seeing, even that disconnect of having it be dubbed made it less effective. So it's a very interesting approach. Other approaches that we have seen that can be effective are things like community notes, right? Which is when people type in and are like, I don't think this is real, right? Or fact check, that's not actually what happened. Another really powerful tool that companies can use are what we call nudges. So that's when you go to just repost something really quickly. A company can design its product to say, we can tell you haven't read this. Are you sure you want to repost it? Would you like to read this before you repost it? Sometimes they do that to me when it's my own article. And so it would be nice if it got a little smarter, but I was like, I guarantee you I've read it. But so nudges can also be and one of the challenges with the calls for companies to take down lots of content is that taking down lots of content on one platform doesn't necessarily fix the content problem, as we talked about, because it's going across so many platforms. So then it's just that one platform is censoring and another platform is not, right? Because every platform has a First Amendment right, at this moment at least, to make its own decisions about what content it will host. And so one of the challenges with just taking content down is that it can actually be less effective and it can give that content more credibility because people think that it's being hidden or it's being censored. And so they tend to buy into it more. So nudging sometimes is actually a more effective approach to countering that than simply removing the information. And that can seem a little bit counterintuitive, but it's based on years and years of research in terms of how people interact with different types of information.
This is Sherry, and I'm going to try to pose a question that we worked on a little earlier because it follows on Becky's question. In your article in Foreign Affairs, you listed, I think, 4 strategies to help protect the elections, our upcoming elections, and one of them had to do with debunking, which you just basically answered. But a second one, and I think what a lot of us are interested in is it's not only what does strategy, what can organizations like League do as an organization, both nationally, of course, we have national, state, and local branches of our organization. And then there's also what we can do as individuals, naturally. But one of the other ones that you mentioned, at least in that article, had to do with ensuring that local and regional civil society leaders beyond usual networks focused on political rights, technology, rule of law are mobilized, because these civic leaders can bring critical local knowledge of voter concerns to the table. And I'd be interested if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because that certainly is the space in which League often operates.
Absolutely. So I would say the very first, sorry, the vice president's going by. There's like a giant motorcade. She lives like right there. One of the absolute best things that I think the League could do to support is poll workers, recruit poll workers, get poll workers there, get them out. So still, a very high percentage of the trust that individuals have in the credibility of an electoral process is based on the human interaction they had at a polling place on the day they cast their vote. That is true not only in the United States, but across the globe. It's a very fundamental part of people feeling like they were part of a free and fair election. There was a friendly face, there was someone trustworthy, there was someone that they felt like they knew, right, who was available to them if there was a problem. The other thing that I think is so important about that is that poll workers then have a line of contact with the local and state electoral officials. Your local and state electoral officials are under attack. They are under budgeted, but they are also across the board. They are under personal threat. Their personal information, their homes, the names of their children, their license plates, that type of stuff is getting put out on different platforms. And they are truly, like, we are seeing electoral officials bounce, right? We're seeing people refuse, they're not taking the jobs. They're leaving because they're literally in danger. And so making sure your local and state electoral officials are supported, that they know that there are people there who will support them, that someone is listening to them and checking in on them. This is not technical. I think it's very important, because for the most part, what they're hearing is threats, right? And what they're hearing is furious people who believe that they are trying to rig an election. The other thing is that there has been a chilling effect on the federal government's ability to raise any of these information issues about elections with the social media platforms, because of a series of lawsuits, as well as a pretty aggressive campaign from Jim Jordan on the House Judiciary Committee, who has been subpoenaing people throughout the executive branch. What that means is that in 2016 and 2020, we had something called the multi-state ISAC. And ISAC is an information, what does ISAC stand for? Information Security Advisory Channel, maybe? The multi-state ISAC is comprised of state and local, territorial, you name it, officials who are all focused on the cybersecurity at the local and state level. And they work with federal cybersecurity experts and the private sector to analyze cybersecurity threats. Out of that came something called the EI ISAC, the Elections Integrity ISAC. That ISAC still exists, and it is composed solely of state and local electoral officials. In 2016 and in 2020, the EI ISAC was working with the federal government, with the CISA, the advisory body inside of DHS for electoral security, to basically push up questions around disinformation or things that they were seeing that were impacting them at the local level. So do you all remember Sharpiegate? You remember the whole controversy about it? There was a Sharpie, and then you're right. That's a prime example of the type of information and confusion that was then flowing through the EL-ISAC, right? That was how the platforms were then, or one solid way that the platforms were getting information from folks at the local level about what was happening, what was true, what was not true. That's how they were understanding impact on the ground on different election days. That system is now broken. And even within, even for the EL-ISAC, we're hearing that state and local officials have also like chilled because the politicization of these questions around censorship and information have become so fraught and so toxic that people feel like they're personally in danger and that they just can't touch it. So one thing that I think the League of Women Voters can do, because it's so respected nationally, is actually try to connect with the folks at the main companies who are working on electoral security to say like, hey, can you give, the League of Women Voters a training on how to flag things on your systems? Can you give us a training on how to report things that, are truly problematic? When we have, for example, a female politician who is, now being subjected to a campaign where, fake pornographic images of her, or frankly, real but non-consensual nude images, right, are being shared, or is the subject of like a deep fake porn video. How do we help bring that to your attention if you're not seeing it? What if it's a municipal election, right? How do you flag that? How do you raise it? And I think that's something where the League of Women Voters could play a really interesting role in helping to think about the sort of basic safety, both of electoral officials, but also the sort of integrity of the information that is being served up to the public. So those are just some ideas, but I think those could be some powerful approaches. In terms of coalitions, I would say, I think some secretaries of state, right, are developing relationships with the platforms. But again, as soon as you get to the Secretary of State, you start getting to a state official telling a platform that information is problematic. And right now, there's a number of cases that are in front of the Supreme Court around whether or not that is a First Amendment violation. That process is called jawboning. And there's going to be oral arguments on that in about 3 weeks. And so you're also seeing a great hesitancy among government officials to raise these issues with the platform because it is not clear in this moment whether that is considered a First Amendment violation.
Just to follow up a little bit, there are a couple of questions in the chat, and then we're going to have Christine Flores ask her question. One was, do you think vote by mail see a good effect that could have on this attacks on at least in-person poll workers and so on? And the second one has to do with that. So do you think the poll workers will actually be safe for these elections?
I think whether poll workers will be safe is so specific to the individual sort of location and dynamics of a particular polling place that it's hard to answer that question at a sort of broad brush. I would say the more poll workers, the greater the safety, arguably. And I would also say ideally, the more diverse the range of poll workers. So really, it kind of doesn't matter where you fall on the political spectrum, so long as you believe that people should have a right to vote, right? Like so really thinking about different communities and how you get people who are trusted and respected in different communities to respect poll workers, you're a lot less likely, I think, to go after poll workers when, someone from your church's brother is there, right? So I think we can overcomplicate this a little bit instead of just saying like, hey, in our district, these are sort of the big, we don't all agree, but we can agree on this. And we really want to show a united front that people should be able to come and vote and be safe. So I think that there's a lot of community organizing that can be done at that level that would be very powerful. And I also think there's a lot of live reporting from the polls that poll workers could potentially do as well throughout the day. That could be really interesting and actually very galvanizing, right? To be like, it's a great day at the polling place, and like there's brownies and whatever. On the mail question, I personally would love it if like we could vote for like a month, right? Like I don't love the fact of anything where everybody has to vote on one day, because I just think it makes it hard for people to vote. That said, the fact right now, I think there's something I would say that is important and actually trust giving about people showing up and having the same experience at a polling place, right? And experiencing that moment of democracy and their vote counting together. I think that's actually a fairly powerful element of our civic identity. So I would be wary of elections where everybody just mails it in, right, or phones it in, because I think we lose that sense of community. I don't have any data on that point. That's a pure gut feeling, just based on years of having been a voter myself. That said, one of the challenges that we really see with mail-in votes is that they are counted late. And that gap, misinformation and disinformation tend to work most effectively when they fill an information void. So when you are waiting for electoral results because mail-in ballots haven't been counted, that creates a significant moment of opportunity to then sow distrust in that process and in that particular election. So I think mail-in ballots are great, but I also think being thoughtful about managing expectations and the timeliness of narrating those returns. I think that timeliness is becoming more and more important, because that limbo that we can have of days or weeks isn't good in a moment of heightened distrust where disinformation can scale so rapidly. So I think in that respect, instead really talking with local electoral officials around like what's going to be the approach to mailing ballots in, how do we make everybody clear on that from the get-go? How do we get really clear expectations established about when this result will be announced? And how do we keep putting credible information into that void throughout that process, right? So here's where we are in counting the votes. Now here's where we are in counting the votes. Now, anything credible that you can put into that void diminishes the opportunity of that void being exploited for false claims.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks for that. That's, a different perspective than that I've actually heard before on some of those. So that was very useful, at least for me personally. So next, I'd like to go to Christine Flores, who's waited patiently with her hand up. So, Christine, would you like to ask your question, please? I don't know. Are you on? You're still on mute, Christine, if you're still with us. We'll give her just
I believe
a
in you,
sec.
Christine.
Yes. Well, while Christine's trying to probably figure out where the mute button is, depending on which device she's in, why don't we go to Heidi? Because she also has her hand up. Maybe these people are maybe they're not real. Maybe they're AI people. Heidi, are you there from Ecosystems or Ecosystem Ad? I can't read the whole thing here on my screen.
Heidi, I see you. I see that you typed into the chat. Do you want to type your question if you can't unmute? Same with Christine. Oh, Christine's from Albany County, New York. That's where I took the bar exam.
Okay.
I wasn't expecting the Irish potato famine in Memorial Garden. It really threw me.
Why don't, Heidi, if you want to type your question in the chat, we see that maybe you can't unmute. Then we'll come back. We'll circle back around to you. Another question here that we had was
This will be done in a few minutes.
on your very comprehensive article, your report with the Atlantic Council, you talked about an emerging field called trust and safety. And that's something that at least I personally hadn't heard about. And I'm interested if you could give us some background on that field and the role you see it playing, at least in the future, if not now, for protecting users' rights and supporting innovation and so on. And what would these kind of efforts, what would it take to make these efforts have a real practical effect?
I would say, first of all, the fact that your spam goes into a spam folder, right? That's trust and safety. The fact that you can go on eBay and report somebody for fraud, like that's trust and safety. The fact that you can flag a message on Facebook as like being harmful, right, or being offensive, that's trust and safety. The fact that some platforms are going to require you to verify your digital identity is also going to be another form of trust and safety. So passwords are another sort of form. The easiest way to think about trust and safety is it's a term that's evolved over the years it captures a squishy field still, an emerging field that is aimed at those people whose job it is to make a particular digital platform, website, whatever it might be, safe and useful and usable for its users. So that differs from the way that we think about cybersecurity or information security, because cybersecurity folks are generally focused on incursions from the outside on their platform, right? So it's people coming from the outside and trying to access their platform in ways that violate the terms of the company, right? That are a clear offense. Trust and safety is how companies deal with people who are using the platform in ways that it was intended to be used, but are doing so for nefarious purposes or in a damaging way. So when you think about Facebook, let's just use that because people know it. Facebook is a platform that is designed to allow you to share messages and news articles and photos and comments and everything with people you know, and also, depending on how you use it, with people you don't, right? Now, what if all the comments that you share with people you don't know are horribly racist or horribly offensive or horribly sexist? The company generally is going to want to have some way of dealing with that with a user who is using the platform in that type of way. Because if a platform is filled with those types of users, people leave. They don't want to stay there anymore, and suddenly you don't have a money generating product, right? And you can't scale. So that's a sort of simple way of thinking about trust and safety as a broad term. The challenge is that overwhelmingly right now in the United States, all of these companies and AI, right, and the evolution of AI, it's governed right now by corporate governance, right? We don't have federal laws. We don't even have a federal data privacy law, right? We don't have government laws that can actually constrain or shape a lot of this. And corporate governance is designed to manage investor risk. It is not designed to manage societal risk. It is not a company's job or a company's board's job to think about its impact on democracy, right? Some companies choose to do that, and the more longstanding companies like Microsoft and Google and Meta would argue that that is a core consideration in thinking about their long-term sustainability. But if you're a startup, right, and you're getting private equity money, your only job is to return value to your investors and to grow. And if your risk is going to occur once you hit scale, right, you're going to have a round of series funding where that risk doesn't actually exist. you may not be able to tell clearly what would happen if you did get to scale, right? I think OpenAI is probably a decent example of that, honestly. So you may not be able to tell at the beginning, but even if you can tell, and even if you're relatively clear on it, we don't have a forcing mechanism right now within corporate governance or our markets to require companies to care about that, or to even allow boards that do want to care about that, or investors that do want to care about that, to point clearly to data or to governance requirements that say, this investment in building trust, this investment in the safety of our users, this investment in thinking about the impacts of our platform is clearly connected to our fiduciary duty, is clearly connected to long-term value generation, is clearly connected to returning value for our shareholders or for our investors. And so that is a huge and fundamental hole right now in terms of our national ability to deal with this, because we don't have the incentives. We have neither the carrots nor the sticks to manage this. And government is designed to manage societal risk, right? But corporate governance is designed to manage investor risk. And so right now, overwhelmingly, we're protecting value for investors far more than we're protecting value for our society. And this is an area where I think the way that we consider free markets in the United States and the use of our markets and our free, and the innovation that they offer in the digital age, we may need to rethink a little bit how much that is. I think of it as pulling from the aquifers of our democracy, pulling from our reservoirs, pulling from our reserves, and giving us a more crumbly foundation. So that's like a big picture note as we go to closing.
Yeah.
But Heidi, we didn't get to Heidi or Christine.
Yeah, I guess Heidi just typed in, and we are at the time, so we will understand if folks have to ring off, but maybe we could just let Kat have opportunity to answer Heidi's questions since she waited so patiently, and then we will sign off.
Okay, so, oh my gosh, Heidi, so many things here. I think everyone has to worry about a lone wolf shooting at the polls because gun control. Very frank, I don't know how we protect against that if you're in a place where lots of people can be angry and have guns. In terms of cyber attacks, I would say I think there is going to be a significantly heightened risk of cyber attacks. I think the cyber attacks are more likely to be on things like electoral websites, right? Or possibly on cell phone services, or possibly, I don't want to speculate too much, but there is the possibility that you see attacks on critical infrastructure in such a way that they can change the sort of dynamic or discourse within an election. But that's highly speculative. I want to be really careful about not fear mongering on that point. Generative AI tools do significantly increase how fast you can try to develop a cybersecurity attack. So that's more where that perspective is coming from. In terms of the electronic voting machines, CISA, so the Cybersecurity Infrastructure, oh God, now I'm going to be embarrassed for not remembering the entirety of the acronym. But anyway, CISA, which is a department of DHS, CISA, has produced wonderful reporting and will continue to produce wonderful reporting on the cybersecurity of elections. And they are working with state and local electoral officials on cybersecurity all over the country. And they're wonderful, and they work so hard to build strong, functional relationships with state and local electoral officials and people who are working at the polls. So I would definitely look to them for a resource, and that they've been doing great work actually on getting voting companies to agree to having people come in and actually try to hack the machine and see if they can find holes and gaps. We've seen a much more aggressive approach to that in a really good way. So CIS is doing great work on that part, and I recommend that you check them out. In terms of something more important to watch, the accuracy of one's election, I mean, there's not a lot of data out there that suggests that elections will be inaccurate, right? Like there's not a sea change that suggests that we have a problem with electoral credibility. We have a perception issue and we have a trust issue. It's not at all clear that we have a real issue, right? Like a fact-based issue. And so I think maybe the most important thing you could do is really be, carefully reading those, like the research that goes into whether or not there were any credibility concerns. And then for those people who feel distrustful, being able to come to them with good factual information about the fact that, I don't know that the credibility of these elections is truly any different than it would have been when I was 25, right? I think there's a lot more, which was a long time ago. I think there's a lot more doubt about the process. I think being very aggressive about watching for intimidation and harassment at the polls will be important. And I think being this is the other thing actually, where AI will also help. Diaspora communities, immigrant communities, I would fully expect immigrant communities to be under heightened threat in this electoral season because of tensions around immigration around the country. But also generative AI tools make it a lot easier to target those populations with languages that aren't necessarily widely spoken, right? So if you have got like a strong refugee community, for example, locally, where you have lots of citizens and they can vote, but they're often operating in as a community in a different language, they're not going to have the same access to, for example, local news sources that are in English, right? Or the same information channels. So thinking as well about how you are connecting expert, credible information on things like electoral safety to community leaders in minority and or marginalized communities is another personal and important thing that I think members of the league can do, because it is going to be in closing that gap that you also stay ahead of some really easy spaces for attack. Telling, for example, a whole community of, a lower income, community that is relying heavily on, Facebook, for example, for its information, having a bunch of information go out to that community in their local language, saying that like voting hours are this and this when they are in fact this and this, right? That's the other type of thing that we should be on the lookout for. And we want to be able to have close connections to help surface when that type of truly just clearly false information is circulating around, or like this polling place is dangerous, right? Or this polling place is closed. Those are the other types of things that we might see, especially right in the lead up to the election. And finally, the other thing, I know we're so over time, I would say the other thing is going to be being very cognizant of fake audio. I think fake audio is a far greater threat this year than fake video. Video has a lot more contextual clues, and it's still harder to do well. Audio requires very small amounts of data in order to do it effectively. And so overwhelmingly, what we're seeing globally is that it's deepfake audio and not deepfake video that is popping up as a real issue. And what becomes important about that is it's not just knowing it's fake, it's that if it's true, it becomes very easy to discount. So you can think in the 2016 election, when the Access Now audio came out from Trump talking about pussy grabbing, right? The debate then was about what does it mean to have a candidate who would say something like that. In 2024, the debate will be, is that audio real? Not what does it mean that person said that? It'll be so easy to say, well, I never said that. That's totally fake, right? So the debate will suddenly become whether or not that is credible. It won't be, what does it mean about the candidate? So that's the other thing I would be on the lookout for this year in terms of an actual new sort of AI-based threat.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kat, for all your time and all the questions from our audience here. I guess we just really need to ring off, but I'm gonna end with a quote that our vice president gave a couple years ago now, but it's actually helped me in times like this. And she said, "This is not a time to throw up our hands. Let us roll up our sleeves. We are in this fight together." And that resonates with me, and I really think it's true, because there are times when I'm like, what am I going to do? And you've given us a lot of ideas of things that we as individuals at our local, state, and national organization can do. And that's so helpful. And we really appreciate your time and your energy and everything you're doing, and keep at it.
I appreciate it. My co-author, Katie, always says panic responsibly. She actually has like t-shirts now.
Yes. Yes.
and what I tend to say is, this is not the moment to check out. This is the moment to check in.
Right.
You don't have to know a thing about tech to check in and be meaningful and important right now in protecting our elections and our votes and our civic spaces. And so I truly hope that all of you feel a little more empowered, like you have a little more agency or a little more of a lexicon at this point. Sherry, I will very happily tomorrow send you a list of different research reports and resources and whatever that you could share if that would be helpful to folks.
Yes.
And I'm just so grateful to all of you for taking the time to join us. And I truly hope I was of service, and let's all go vote. Except for me, I live in Washington, D.C.
Well, we're trying to get you to vote.
I mean, I'd be stoked. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Instead, I'm just going to go get in my car with my taxation without representation license plate.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. And I guess we'll close. And all these recordings are on League of Women Voters of Maine's website. So you can listen to ones we've had earlier, and you can clue your friends and colleagues into listening to this. This one that Kat gave us, it'll probably be a day or so before they get it up there, but perhaps there also we could have some other resources shown. So thank you so much, Kat.
And then you have the Zoom transcript because AI.
Yes, and we have the Zoom transcript as well. So thank you all.
Bye, everyone. It was a joy to see you. Take care. Have a great night.
We'll see you next month.
Yeah.